Here we go again. It's February in South Africa, which means student protests at many universities over exclusion based on debt owed and over lack of accommodation. It's so sad that it's a crisis every single year. And I think at this point, a full decade, 10 years after fees must fall, we need to talk about the structural issues, which means that every year this crisis happens again. So we're going to look at 3 questions to better understand this every year crisis. 1, what are the students supposed to do? 2, what are universities supposed to do? And then 3, what really needs to happen from the ANC-led government, who has done so much to cause this never-ending crisis in higher education. So this is the issue with the higher education crisis. You're watching The Issue with Dan Corder. South Africa is a movie. Welcome to the watch party. Just in case you still don't know, we have been covering this story as it develops and all the other big stories in South Africa on our weekday morning News Worth Knowing podcast called Dan Corder in the Morning. We have a WhatsApp line, 0607613436, and we have these massive discussions and learn and better understand what's going on in the country, including on stories like this. Find us there. Frankly, the headlines that have been written in the last few days about UCT, about what's going on there, could have been written in 2019, 2017, 2015, even before fees must fall, because the same thing happens every single year. Firstly, some students who've been staying in accommodation at UCT, and this is true of all the universities, maybe they're doing summer school, maybe they had to stay at campus because they had to do repeats, they are given until a certain amount of time to leave their accommodation. And what happens sometimes is university students who've been staying over the summer refuse to leave. And then universities try to make them move out. And the students say, but we have nowhere to go. We can't afford to go anywhere else. We need to stay around here. We can't leave. They refuse to. And then eventually universities are forced to issue eviction notices. The next thing that happens is a lot of university students arrive to discover that they can't afford the accommodation. Or if they're on NSFAS, that NSFAS has bungled their profile, meaning that they've not got the money they need to pay the upfront deposits or fees required to stay in a university residence. And so university students arrive, they can't get accommodation. The university doesn't have enough accommodation for them, and the university students are left bereft, and in cases like CPUT, literally sleeping on the street. Then what happens is university students arrive who have passed the previous academic year, and so they are entitled to go and study their degrees further, but they owe outstanding fees that they couldn't afford to pay from the year before. And different universities have different policies on this, but essentially, if you are in arrears, if you've not paid for the courses that you've already done, most universities have a policy that you can't continue on your academic journey, sign up for new courses if you haven't paid for those previous courses that you've already done. And then it all comes to a head. What happens is there are protests and there are disruptions to try and force a change of power dynamic, of power balance between the institution and the students. This is generally when student representative councils get involved. Very, very often they do good work. Very, very often SRCs do bad work. And every single year there are certain people at certain SRCs in certain universities who decide that this is going to be their big struggle revolutionary moment to make a name for themselves so that they can later forge a relationship with an impressive political party to create a political career for themselves. And that's where it gets really ugly and really awful, because SRCs and sometimes also universities act in bad faith. And when an SRC does that, when an SRC directs the students who are listening to it to do certain things that are not effective protest, that will be harmful and damaging and lead to those students being at risk, that's when SRCs take advantage of students in really cruel and awful and unacceptable ways for certain members of those SRCs' self-advancement. So, question 1, what are the students supposed to do? Because critics will say they shouldn't protest and they shouldn't disrupt and they shouldn't come to university if they can't afford it and didn't they know better and all that. And to that I say so many things. Firstly, I don't want to live in a country where somebody who's had to fight so hard and get good enough marks to be lucky enough to be of the small group of matriculants who actually makes it into higher learning, who've earned their right through their academics to be there, do not get into universities and get those opportunities because they can't afford it. And remember, there are programs like NSFAS which help the most impoverished students, but there are many students in what is called the missing middle. They come from families which make just enough money such that these students don't qualify for NSFAS, but their families still don't make enough money to be able to put them and their other students through school, through university, and to cover all of the other costs of life. Those students should not suffer being excluded from university on the grounds that they don't have enough money. Then there are students for whom the NSFAS system just fails because they don't get the money on time, they randomly get disqualified from stuff. NSFAS is so riddled with corruption and mismanagement and dysfunction that even just late last year, there were students who weren't getting any monies that they were supposed to get per month to literally eat, have transport from, because NSFAS had updated through a dodgy tender some kind of system of rollout of payments, which meant that there were students trying to write exams and going to soup kitchens to get the only food that they could to eat from their universities. Those students shouldn't suffer academic exclusion either. And that leads to the next thing. Those students shouldn't also suffer lack of accommodation. They shouldn't suffer the fact that they can't personally afford to stay near enough to a university or on campus to get what they deserve to get, which is an opportunity in higher education. So what are they supposed to do in this situation? They are supposed to protest and disrupt because ultimately they are fighting to change the power imbalance. They are fighting to change the reality of their situation to give themselves a chance. The alternative is what? To go home, to give up on that dream, to lose out on the studies that you've already done and the money you've already paid for those studies. That's absurd. And protests do have to be disruptive. A protest isn't a protest if it's approved. If something is approved and permitted, it's not going to be effective. And so of course students are going to protest. Of course they're going to disrupt. What else are they supposed to do? What are universities supposed to do? Because universities are ultimately businesses which have a certain amount of money coming in so that they can get a certain amount of product and service out. That is a harsh, brutal reality in South Africa. But universities need to create policies and systems that allow them to provide education to people at a good enough standard. Universities can't endlessly build more accommodations or subsidize more accommodations or subsidize more food or more travel or more transport, because literally where is the money going to come from to pay for that? Universities get some funding from government, but not enough. And universities also have what I think is the correct pressure from government to accept more and more students over time. Most universities in South Africa are accepting way more students than they used to, but that means they need to build out capacity to provide for these students. And in the vast majority of cases, they literally do not have the funding, they do not have the financial support from government, and they can't charge high enough fees to students and others to be able to pay for the services that they need to provide to these students as functional universities. If they literally can't afford to provide, create more accommodation at a lower rate, what are they supposed to do? Different universities try to create different policies based on the kind of financial means that they have. UCT, for example, has a policy whereby you can enroll for more courses if your outstanding debt to the institution is below 10,000 Rand, but not over. Other institutions don't have that kind of money to be able to create that kind of flexible financial leeway. Some universities act in very bad faith, the same way that SRCs do in some cases, some students. But ultimately, the question is, if they need this money and they don't have it and they can't get it from anywhere, what is a university supposed to do? What needs to happen is true accountability from the ANC-led government now, because the ANC government has consistently for years dangled free higher education in front of young people's noses and said that they will give it and they will do it. Jacob Zuma, in the last days of his presidency, just declared that this was now a thing. They created expectations amongst people that no kind of financial limitations, no lack of money would never stop them from accessing or getting the ticket to this life transformative higher education. And yet consistently, the government, the ANC-led government, for the longest time under Blade and Zamande until recently, has screwed up NSFAS, which screws up students' lives, has disregarded the serious concerns of universities.
If the students don't accept this, we'll start our own movement. Students must fall.
And has completely walked away or avoided the crisis when it happens between universities and students. And the reality is, in a country where so many people are impoverished due to unjust historic awfulness from apartheid and before, If the government is going to commit that nobody should be denied their opportunity to higher education, they need to stop allowing universities to take the punches, and they need to come in and really say, we're going to make higher education free and we are going to pay for it. We're going to financially enable universities to provide what they need to students, and we're going to run NSFAS well enough that it actually does its job effectively to help the most impoverished of students. That's what needs to happen. Unfortunately, it's extremely hard to hold a government accountable through protest. So what you do is you protest against the institution, hoping to force the institution to change its behavior to one degree or another, and then hoping that if the university kind of exhausts all of its means and resources, then maybe the university will have a degree of bargaining power and leverage to change and lobby against the government to change its policies. But that has consistently not worked. And that's why every single year we have the same crisis again, the government watching quietly with disinterest from the sidelines as students and universities have this awful, awful, awful scenario. So what we need actually is not to have a crisis once a year where students arrive, many of them first years, and are desperately trying to make it work for themselves right now, where universities are desperately trying to help the students right now. We need a concerted, every day of the year, long campaign involving all kinds of civil society stakeholders, universities, students, and the rest, to create a pressure to force the ANC-led government to arrest this crisis, to provide the resources required to match the vision that they've sold South Africans. And it needs to happen this way because democratic mechanisms haven't worked. The ANC hasn't changed its ways based on its fear of maybe losing power at the ballot box. And also because legal mechanisms are very slow. So if you take the government to court, you may ultimately be successful, but it may take an extremely long time. And the nature of these university and student crises is that they're urgent. Students need money, accommodation, food, resources, and the opportunity to study right now, today. They can't wait for a long, drawn-out legal process. Universities need resources to provide for students today. And so if there's no kind of groundswell mobilization to force government to create a solution, I'll just release this video again next year in 2026 February, and then February 2027, and all of it will be exactly the same. That's what needs to happen. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the podcast.